Okay, this is part 3. So we are done with grammar translation method, and then the reform movement started. This is still old times in the 1880s. And this is also understood in your book as the part of the serious methods. Going and the serious method. There is a change in paradigm. Here, there is a focus on phonetics as a discipline, and we moved on to studying spoken language, producing phrases, idioms, and there was a lot of training, drilling on terms of pronunciation habits. Here, grammar is different as it is learned inductively. What do we mean by inductive learning of grammar? They don't explicitly teach you the rules. They show you, you're exposed to the different forms of the language, and eventually you catch them up. You hypothesize in your mind and you come up with the rules. So the serious method in your book is part of this. So this change, this shift is towards spoken language, and the input is very important. You're going to listen, do receptive work first before moving to what you can see in written form. Words are presented in sentences in a meaningful context, and the grammar rules, as I said, they are presented in context and not explicitly. In this case, very different from what was done previously, translation was avoided at all costs. Before we move on to the direct method, here, when we think about the principles that underlie these methods, is that they, in terms of how do we learn a new language, the first language, how we learn the first language is used as a model. So basically we're going to learn a second language in the same way children learn a language. So this means that that's why translation is not used. You are in monolingual classes where there is demonstration, where there is action, and basically a lot of input that is meaningful, that is basic. Yes. And then we move on to the direct method, which is, funnily enough, still used today. If you know the Berlitz Institute, it's a language institute just like the Britannico or Wall Street, they still use this method. And here the classroom instruction is only in the target language, and everyday vocabulary is taught. This is important because as I mentioned earlier, we see second language learning the same way a child learns their first language. So the vocabulary, the same way a vocabulary we use with a child, the vocabulary is everyday vocabulary, immediate vocabulary, we could say. And there are short exchanges, again, based on oral skills. In the direct method, this is Goen's method, grammar is also taught inductively, the same way. You don't teach grammar to a child, right? Basically, they are exposed to the input and eventually they learn the rules. And just like with a child, there is always concrete vocabulary. One technique that is using realia, basically real things, using pictures, association of ideas. I invite you to quickly do a YouTube search and look for the direct method. Just find a short video. Usually you're going to see this with children, and you're going to see how the use of pictures and the basic language is being used. Don't spend too much time on that, though. It's just for you to have an idea. So as oral, the oral input from the teacher, then the learner has to learn how to listen first, just like first language learning. Before a child produces language, sorry, I got stuck there. Before a child produces language, they are exposed to a lot of input and they learn to understand, and that comes before production. We're going to see that as part of another method later on. And there is an focus on grammar and pronunciation, probably just, let's say, with more drilling and more input. So the criticism to the direct method is that it's just basically exposing, just input, but not really a methodology, just sticking to basic language. So that's the main criticism. Still, I think the contribution to this is how important with children it is to, with children and basic users more than children, but anyone who's learning a new language, thinking that the target of what they can achieve is facilitated by input. Input is very important. Grammar is not taught explicitly, and that the language at the beginning has to be, rather than basic, very familiar, very everyday.